Dave, I think we can start. Let the people join.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Good morning and good evening, and welcome to the seventh uh, seminar of the Thursday Forum seminar series on migration and diaspora. And today we are going to talk about refugee women in Europe, policy issues and challenges. And we have amongst us Professor Beatriz Padilla, who is going to talk about this issue. So, before we begin, I would just like to talk about what the Thursday Forum seminar series is. It is an initiation by the students of MA and PG diploma in migration and diaspora at the Indira Gandhi National Open University, New Delhi. Scholars, policy experts, grassroots activists from government, academia, UN organization, civil society organizations, and industries are invited to participate in the deliberation. What are the main objectives of this series? Discussions around migration governance and challenges at various levels, highlighting issues related to youth, gender, and children, creating awareness through sustained conversation with experts from various sectors, creating a broad-based linkage with institutions working on migration and diaspora issues, highlighting the best practices around the globe, and to disseminate this information. So before we get on talking, I would like to introduce Dr. Padilla to all of you. Dr. Padilla holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Illinois and master's in public affairs from the University of Texas. She has a bachelor's in political science from Argentina. Her dissertation focused on women's organizing in a global context, activism in El Salvador, Brazil, at the crossroad of race, class, and gender. She has conducted fieldwork in Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Mexico, Uruguay, Chile, and Portugal, and also in the US with Latino populations in the Midwest and Florida, and with Brazilians in Portugal and California. Dr. Padilla joined the Department of Sociology at the University of South Florida in 2018, and she is an affiliated researcher with the University of Lisbon. And she has also created the first summer school on Latin America today, and she's launched a series of research focusing on the comparative and transnational studies. Dr. Padilla is engaged in many international research projects and networks. She coordinates the Venezuelan humanitarian crisis, migration, trauma and resilience, and trajectory of refugees, gender, intersectionality, and public policy in Portugal. She has also done research which was in the EU and Latin America about the health and citizenship gaps and need in the intercultural healthcare to immigrant mothers. And she was also involved in, uh, you know, getting together the European universities and schools in human rights. And she was a consultant with the International Organization for Migration and the Portuguese presidency of the Council of European Union on issues of migration. As a migration scholar from the global south, her interests involved the transatlantic region that includes Latin America, Europe, and the US. Her research focuses on different aspects of migration processes, public policy, health and diversity, gender, race, ethnicity, and discrimination. And she has published in international journals in different languages. She is an active member of the Latin American Studies Association since 1988. And she has been very committed to what she is doing. I can go on and on because we have somebody very experienced with us, and I'm very, very glad to have you, Professor. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm like honored. This is, a lot. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope to meet your expectations. So I'll be focusing on a research project that I did in Portugal some years ago, not too long ago, but after the refugee crisis, or the so-called refugee crisis in Europe, and focusing mainly in the case of Portugal. But I can, for the question and answer section, I could answer other type of questions. So let me start first by sharing my screen and making sure that everything is ready. And let me get this. Let me move this out of my, okay. So again, thank you for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I need to start moving the slides. So first of all, I would like to emphasize the relevance of the issue of women and migration, and acknowledge that, well, tomorrow is International Women's Day, and also in the US we celebrate Women's History Month. So this is a very relevant topic during March, but also during throughout the year. I just want to also emphasize also the relevance of gender when studying migration and diaspora. As you know, for a long time, migration was not even considered. And whenever we talk or discuss or even study migration, it was just focusing on the so-called migrant that was always seen as the male migrant. But things have changed so much in the last decades or so. But even if we look into history, we know that women were always migrated, but the focus was never on them. So this has, this led to invisibility of the phenomenon. But there are also many consequences for not focusing on gender issues when we study migration. So I want to emphasize the relevance. We also know that there are many differences due to sex and gender, as when women are subject of migration is very different than when males are. So this is, is something that we always need to keep in mind. And also this has consequences at the level of policy making and the implementation of those policies, because if gender issues are not considered, if policies are gender blind, then we are having issue. We're having a problem, but because we're not necessarily addressing the needs of a group of or a certain population. And then when the policies are implemented, the same thing. So I'll be looking a little bit at that today. And we also need to acknowledge how origin and destination countries and societies impact women experiences. And this is going to lead us something that I'll talk a little bit later, is about the idea of gender regimes, because they are gender regimes and gender is lived and experienced differently in different countries. And when we are migrants, we experience those gender regimes differently. And then obviously this is going to be much more relevant or much more evident when we talk about the global north and the global south and the difference across this context. And as I said, today I'll be starting with Europe in general, but I'll be focusing much more on the case of Portugal. So to make sure that it's clear what I'll be talking about. So I just want to first set this, set this easy, right? Nowadays, about 281 million people, which represents about 3.6% of the world's population, live outside the country of origin. For many of them, for many of these migrants, migration is characterized by varying degrees of compulsion. So it's not something they do because of their choice. So when we talk about migrants, they are migrants. We talk about different kind of migrants, so different kind of mobile population. We have the migrants themselves, but we also have refugees and asylum seekers, and much more lately, we also have a lot of internally displaced people that up to some, not too long ago, they were not necessarily considered international migrants because they are not international migrants, but nowadays they are also considered under the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And this is a large portion of the population. Also, because we're going to be talking about Europe, we also need to understand that the majority of refugees are located out of Europe. So even if the crisis I'll be talking is about Europe, then we should consider the majority of the refugees are out of this region and maybe have less access to resources, to programs, and they are much more in a survival mode. So in 2015 to 2016, Europe faced its worst refugee crisis since World War II, with more than 1 million people applying for asylum in the region. This situation led to questioning the so-called European Union's freedom of movement value. As you know, the European Union has this freedom of movement within the European borders, and what to do when crises such as that arise. So who receives the pressure? Here, geographic location seems to play a role. And actually at that time, it played a role. And the question was, is there solidarity? Was there any kind of solidarity among member states? Again, European Union was founded under the idea of collaboration and working together of the different member states, right? At that time, with the refugee crisis, the European Union put in place policies to deal with the situation, but the different kind of policy. One of the policies that was put in place, it was what is called normally outsourcing. Outsourcing means giving money, a lot of money, a lot of millions, to control the borders, in this case to Turkey. So Turkey would be taking the responsibility and care of people not crossing Turkey to get to Europe. So that was one of the policies that they did. The other policies that they applied, it was how to manage. They had to decide how to manage all these new recent arrivals that were thousands and thousands every day, and how to distribute them. So these are different kind of policies, one outsourcing, trying to displace the problem abroad or farther away from the borders. This had been done before with, for example, with Morocco, trying to avoid the incoming migration to the Canary Islands, but in this case was to Turkey. And the management, once people arrived to Europe, they had to see what they were going to do. So how to distribute this arrival. And although I will not be talking about Ukraine, the most recent crisis is the one caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war that Europe is facing. But I think it could be important to reflect on what I'll be talking and presenting, because then we can wonder if there are lessons learned from the previous crisis, right? Although this is not going to be my focus. So there seems to be there's an ongoing refugee crisis. We like to always talk about crisis, but what we see is an ongoing different type of refugee crisis. So if we consider some numbers, again, in 2022 alone, there were over 150,000 sea arrivals in Italy, Greece, Spain, Cyprus, and Malta, which are kind of the border countries, bordering mainly within the Mediterranean, right? With other regions. So that means that, although we talk about the refugee crisis in 2017 and 16, the arrivals never end. 40% of the sea arrivals to Europe are women and children, something that probably did not happen so often before, but since 2015, that number has increased. So that means that we need to think about policies for them differently. And more than 2,400 individuals were reported dead or missing due to dangerous sea journeys. So we also know that there are a lot of people who disappear in the Mediterranean. Many of them also could be women and children. And then if we think about what happens so this leads us to think what has happened since the crisis in 2015-16. And here I had two graphs rapidly that you can see. One, it shows the number of arrival to Central and Eastern Mediterranean routes in between 2014, so right before the beginning of the crisis, to 2017. And we can see a peak, a huge peak in the Eastern Mediterranean route in 2015. And that's, the arrival of these thousands and thousands of people. And then here I'm just showing you a picture of the resettlement plan that was done by the European Union. So to those people arriving to mainly Italy and Greece, where to relocate them. And then you see that obviously there are large countries like Germany, France, and Spain that took a lot of refugees, but you also see Portugal, which is a very, very small country that also took a large number of them. So I want to make the argument from, that we're talking about an issue for the European Union, but mainly also for Portugal, that moved from the insignificance to significance. So, and in this context of migration. So there's an increasing number of refugees and asylum seekers worldwide. And keep in mind that refugees and asylum seekers are two different things. At a point, they might be seen as the same population, but they are not. In 2023, over 108 million refugees and asylum seekers or displaced people were around the world. Many of them have arrived or hope to arrive to the European Union. So for the European Union, migration and refugees is always an issue. Since the refugee crisis in 2015, or the refugee crisis, sorry, as in 2015 should be seen as a turning point. So an inflection point for Portugal and the European Union. There were at that time many programs targeting refugees. These programs coexisted. And I know this can be a little bit confusing, but think about the refugees themselves who are arriving and maybe are put into, if they're lucky enough, they're put into these different kind of programs. So there was the relocation program, the resettlement program, the people that were rescued from the sea that then were put in a different program, and then what is called the spontaneous arrival, which are the incoming or the kind of the traditional refugees that arrive to a country. But you see so many different programs. So at that time in 2015, there were heated debates in the European Union on refugees, solidarity, and the European Union principle across Europe. What should be done, how to face this crisis, especially considering that solidarity is a value or principle that Europe has embraced. But nowadays, after 6-7 years, now we see what some authors have called a fatigue or solidarity fatigue after so many crises. So, and kind of happened in both crises, the 2015-16, when the refugees started arriving, there was some solidarity. And after that, kind of people and population, both government and, Europeans kind of getting tired of the situation. Same thing we see with the Ukrainian situation, that after, a rapid reaction that maybe was based on having led with the situation before, it has been leading to fatigue because the war is not over, things keep changing. So this is also a common trend that sometimes we see around not just migration, but crises that refer to refugees. At that time, Portugal adopted an open arms policy. And there's something that you need to understand about Portugal. Portugal is a very small country in Europe. However, likes to be a trendsetter. They want to set the trends for certain things. So they invest when it comes to policy, especially migration policy and integration policy. It likes to invest in good image and good publicity because it likes to receive recognition. So when the refugee crisis came, which was right after Portugal was coming out of one of the worst recessions and crises, and after the Portugal bailout. So keep in mind that situation. There was not Portugal having a very good, like it was not in a very good economic situation at that time. So at that time, they adopted this open arm policy, and then when the European Union requests countries to accept or to take refugees, Portugal agreed to this request to take refugees, even if facing difficulties to handle them. So the question is, was Portugal prepared to do that? Did it have the resources and the political will to follow through? Or how was it going to follow through? So again, to keep explaining this, the situation, Portugal and the European Union have an evolving complex and multi-layered legal system for refugees. So it's not easy to understand. And it's always evolving because of the situation that changes all the time. So in the EU, there's the Dublin Convention, first one and the first and the second, to the 1997 and 2002. There's also the temporary protection that was approved in 2013. Then the European migration agenda with different specific policies in 2015. That led finally to the so-called Relocation and Common European Asylum System, CS, that was approved in 2016. So we see how this has been a relevant topic also in the European Union. But what happened once you are a member state in the European Union, so national policies must adopt and adapt. So first they must adopt international conventions, all of them, because it's not something optional according to EU policies, but also countries have to transpose the European Union directives. So the European Union directives are legal frameworks that are approved at the European Union level and must be transposed or embraced or incorporated into the national legal frameworks. So again, with this transposition and with this incorporation, there has been a creation of different statutes for refugees or for people that need protection. So it's subsidiary protection, temporary protection, humanitarian protection. So all these new status versus a decreasing number of refugees. So a decreasing number where countries are more hesitant about the official recognition of refugees, about granting refugee status. So all those asylum seekers, instead of becoming refugees, kind of are granted some of this protection, you know, the subsidiary, temporary, or humanitarian, which will imply or have different legal consequences and access to resources. So this is a trend in both in Portugal and in the European Union. Instead of recognizing refugees, that's supposed to be a more permanent status, people are giving all these others that are more temporary and precarious. Also, there is a system, Portugal, that has a system very complex of agencies and partners that were working in two different models, a reception model and kind of integration and accompaniment model as two different phases, but very confusing. So this set or this group of actors was a multiplicity, implying multiplicity of actors serving refugees, and again, under very different programs. So it was CEF, which is the International Border Police, the Portuguese Council for Refugees, and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, taking care of the spontaneous requests, then the Portuguese Council for Refugees and the Reception Center taking care of other, the Misericordia, which is is a set of organizations that were taking care of the rejected cases and the appeal cases, and there were other organizations like Social Security, et cetera, also dealing with different group of refugees or asylum seekers, until finally the operative group of cooperation on asylum seekers and international protection protocol was kind of put in place. So it took until 2020 to get a more consolidated system of reception and integration of asylum seekers and beneficiaries of international protections. You see, 5 years, and throughout these years, it was very confusing for the people that have arrived at different times. And I'll be talking about that a little bit. So as we see, the categories of refugees in the Portuguese context were several. So again, 2015 was a turning point for the crisis. And it meant, and it translated for Portugal, and an exponential increase. But you also need to understand that this was an exponential increase, but still reduced in number, because Portugal is a small country. So Portugal occupied the 6th position within the European Union to receive refugees from the EU relocation program. So there was a kind of a false promise that was made about receiving 10,000 refugees, and only half or less than half was received throughout the first 2 years that, when the promise had been done. In total, only 1,500 cards were given to people coming from Greece and Italy, more men than women, and most of them were coming from Syria, Iraq, and Eritrea. So that was related to the relocation program. Also, there were this ever-evolving category of profile of refugees and asylum seekers, programs that were designed for them, and different responsible entities. So entities that would take responsibility to deal with this different kind of refugees of asylum seekers. So the Portuguese Refugee Council, they dealt mainly with the spontaneous arrivals, that they're never too many, because these people tend to arrive on airports. And then there was the resettlement program and the new resettlement program, people coming from Egypt and Turkey after some screening. And that was dealt by the International Organization for Migration, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and the High Commission for Migrations in Portugal at that time. There was also the relocation program from Greece and Italy. That a lot of people came, but not everyone stayed. This was coordinated by the International Organization for Migration and the High Commission for Migrations in Portugal. And so you see the selection process involved different steps and choices, and refugees had the opportunity to choose 8 different locations where to go. And actually, nobody chose Portugal. So that's once they came, a lot of them left because they didn't want to come to Portugal. They didn't want to, many of them had never heard about Portugal. So even though Portugal was interested in receiving them or hosting them, people were not willing to, which was also a problem because half of them left. And then they were retaken because once they were caught in a different European country, they were sent back to the country that had granted the status. So a lot of layers of confusion, as you can see, but people did not know, they were not necessarily aware, or they did not want to stay in Portugal when they probably had families in the Netherlands, in Germany, et cetera, et cetera. And then we had the other program that is called the relocation from the humanitarian boats or the rescue missions that were taking place in the Mediterranean, also implied later a new European Union redistribution. And Portugal took some cases. In this case, many women. So when this was happening, Portugal also had decided to redistribute geographically throughout different municipalities, the refugees that were coming. Even when some of these municipalities had a very weak or non-existent infrastructure, for example, maybe there were not mosques or temples in the interior or these very far away municipalities, again, maybe creating a lot of like noise and people were not very happy. More recently, with the Ukrainian and also the Afghanistan crisis, some of these situations have taken place again, but I'm not including in my study. So here, just quickly, so you can see some numbers and see here like the peak of decisions. So these are not when people arrive, but when the decisions are made, which usually takes 1 or 2 years instead of doing under, like a shorter period of time as is mandated by law. So we see here there's more subsidiary protection than refugee status. And again, just showing the trend that I was mentioning. And also the people that were coming from Egypt or Turkey and when they arrived to Portugal. So then you see that these numbers are not huge number, but it could become a large number when you don't have infrastructure, when the country is small, when there's not a lot of institutions or organizations that have experience working with migrants. And that was one of the issues. And finally here, again, the type of refugees or subsidiary protection offer to people arriving in Portugal. And this last one, just to give you an idea, again, the similarities and differences between subsidiary protection and the refugee status, just showing the 10 main nationalities. So Syria occupies the first place in both, but then you see that some countries repeat, like Iraq, Eritrea. But you see that at that time, even before the Ukrainian war, there were subsidiary protection offered to Ukrainians, and then you see how also involved some countries in Africa, where Portugal has long-standing relations because with the former colonies. But they also some of them are kind of repeats, but some of them are different. And here, this slide just to show that people, especially those coming from Egypt and Turkey, had pre-departure orientations, but you see how this orientation varies significantly across countries. So Portugal was one of the countries that offered pre-orientation at very last minute. So people don't even know in like 3 or 4 days before they left or the departure from Egypt and Turkey, where they were going. And then, maybe a few days before having like a year and like a 1 day and a half long orientation with, maybe very incomplete notion of what to expect in Portugal. And something that we find out through in our research, it was that there were a lot of promises being made during orientation that were not going to take place or did not realize or became real once they arrived. So this is something to take into account. And you can see that while, for example, the Netherlands had 12 weeks or 12 days, I'm sorry, of orientation and explanation, a kind of, the ones coming to Portugal was 1 day and a half. So now, before getting started into the project, I want to, and because we're talking about gender, and because Europe and Portugal have very specific gender policies, I want to spend some time explaining what is this gender mainstreaming and what I'm talking, the target policy, so maybe targeting a specific populations such as women and children versus gender mainstreaming that has a very different mindset. So in the context of migration, then we need to understand how gender mainstreaming works in the EU and Portugal. So the Council of Europe developed this concept of gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming is not just about women, but about ensuring that women's as well as men experiences and concerns are built into the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of policy, legislation, and spending programs, and that both individual rights and structural inequalities are addressed. It adopts a gender equality perspective, not a gender equity perspective. So if this is very, very important, because equality, the starting point from equality is that everyone should receive the same. While equity means that you give them what they need in order to attain the same level or a certain level of, enjoying services or enjoying rights. So this is very specific here. Gender mainstreaming emphasizes equality, but there are existing or pre-existing inequalities that are not being addressed. So again, it focuses on both sexes, men and women, assuming that there exists real basic equality and access to resources. And then if you think about migrants and refugees, this is probably very untrue. Also, the European guidelines for gender equality promote increasing female labor market participation and economic independence of women and men. So kind of forcing women to work, to promote economic independence, but forcing females or women to be in the labor market, with the idea of reducing the gender gap, earning and or the gender pay, earning and pension gaps, and thus fighting poverty among women, promoting equality between women and men in decision making, equal treatment legislation, integration of the gender perspective in all policies, and a specific measure for the advancement of women. However, these specific measures tend to be less common or contemplated in policymaking. So even though these umbrella policies may seem fair or relevant, if you think or picture the specific audience and population that we are focusing on, which is refugee women or asylum seeker who are women and probably have less protection, can we apply equity? Can we apply equality when there's like so much inequality embedded in their situation? So when the European Union policy making during the refugee crisis was expected to embrace and adopt this gender mainstreaming, right? So now let me talk a little bit about the project that I conducted in Portugal. It was called Refugee Women's Trajectories, Gender Intersectionality, and Public Policy. This was an action collaborative research project that took place in Portugal between 2019 and 2021, which adopted a gender perspective and an intersectional analysis to assess the experiences and trajectory of women and their families who were refugees or asylum seekers in the context of the refugee crisis. So the timeline 2018-2021, it was supported by European funds from FAMI that funds the integration of third country nationals, meaning people not from Europe, and from the High Commissioner on Migration. It took place in the Lisbon metropolitan area, with most of the refugees and asylum seekers came. And why it was done? It was proposed because previous studies, or some of the, not too many studies on refugees in Portugal, had been focusing on men. In previous studies, even if you wanted to work or focus on female refugees, it was almost impossible. It was very, very difficult because there were not many female refugees. So the aim of the project was to identify and describe the trajectories of female refugees and asylum seekers in Portugal, analyze the experience of refuge and integration using a gender and intersectional perspective. So in this case, what was new? Again, it was the female refugees or asylum seekers and the gender and intersectional analysis that had not been applied previously to this population. Another aim was to understand the realities from their own lived experiences and views. And this is, we want you to hear their voices. And I know this seems like redundant and obvious, but it's not necessarily. And it's not necessarily with this type of population, mainly because there are a lot of gatekeepers that keep refugees or asylum seeker women, away from researchers. And also the idea, we want you to avoid the mediators. Many times these gatekeepers, most of the times, either governmental officers or people working for NGOs, do not allow direct communication. So what we hear is about women, but not their voices. And we want you to solve that. We want you to hear them say what was their experience. And also we want you to map, analyze, and understand the reception and integration programs for refugee women, focusing both on state actors and non-state actors' responses. So I want you to see what the state was doing and what the civil society organization were doing and why they were working together. And all this taking place in a changing context. And this is all because when we submitted the application or the research proposal, until you get approved or you get an okay, it takes some time and sometimes a long time. And when the approval came, a little bit of the reality in Portugal had changed. So we decided to shift and adapt to that new reality. So originally we were going to focus only on Syrian migrants because the crisis was about Syrian refugees and asylum seekers. But when we started the project, there were people coming, as I mentioned, from the boats. There were not Syrians. They were coming from Africa. And there were other people coming from other regions. So we thought, since we were doing the research, it would be much more productive to map this new reality. So we did. The methodology, we adopted a qualitative and action research approach, as I mentioned, to map the life trajectories and the biographies of these refugees or asylum seeker women. So we did in-depth interview with refugees, asylum seekers, 17 from different origins and programs. We were aiming a maximum diversity sample, not too many people or not too many people from the same country, but on the other, not like just the opposite, to get kind of a survey of the different population to see what was their experience like, if they had or not the same experience. We also did a lot of spent hours and hours of participant observation and accompanying women, refugee women or asylum seeker to appointments, to things that they needed to do, and to some group discussion that they had with an NGO. Then the aspect of participatory action research also had different steps and ways to apply it. One was to hire a community researcher, and also because that was not enough, we included community translators. And the idea to hire a community researcher and community translator and make them part of the research team was to offer some capacity building strategy for them. So as assuming that there were going to be also refugees or asylum seekers or people from those countries, that they could learn some skill and maybe improve their position in the labor market, and also for empowering the community. Then the other was community alliance building as a process. So it's a process that starts with when the project starts and keeps building and ongoing throughout the process, which consists in adding people to an informal network and with the idea of giving sustainability to the project. When the project is gone, disappear, or the funding is finished, all these connections can be kept by especially state actors and NGOs and refugee women to kind of keep working on issues. For that, we had discussion groups with civil society organizations, with government officials, and with academia. And, throughout time, that ended up leading to a moment that we call a community forum, with a lot of exchange and making sure that these connections were made. We also did discussion group with refugee women, and we planned some empowering actions on intervention. However, because of COVID, we were not able to implement many of them. And then finally, we mapped the reception and integration programs that were carried out by state and non-state actors to assess if they had a gender perspective, if they had incorporated any kind of gender interest or in the policy. And for that, we interviewed with civil society organizations and state actors that were serving refugees and asylum seekers population. So in the end, we talked to 21 different actors, organizations, and we had different, like 19 meetings with them. They also carry out like an online survey with NGOs and civil society organizations to map some of the existing programs for refugees. And we got 14 responses. Something that I consider relevant is to talk a little bit about the research, the positionality of us, the research team. So in the research team, it was we were 3 female, 3 feminists from the Global South. We consider ourselves feminist by training and by practice, 2 Brazilians and 1 Argentinian, and all of us with migrant identities. All of us had previous experience in working with refugees, researching refugees, although it was mainly males because there were no females, as I mentioned before. We had experience also in working in several programs that focus on migrant women from different contexts and origins. And we also have our self-perception and identification as Latina from the Global South, that this is something later to reflect how is that we were seen. So all of these were intertwined. The research strategies also contemplated building trust with women, involving the research team, as well as the community researchers and translators. So, but I don't have too much time to talk about it, but building trust is not so easy. And then even though we made the efforts and we identify as, people from the Global South in the same case as most of the refugees and asylum seekers, the refugees themselves, they did not necessarily see us an insider. They saw us more as outsiders, given our very different origins. So sometimes I think this is important just to reflect how is that we see ourselves and how others can see us when we're doing field work. So the theoretical framework for this was mainly, we adopted several ones, combined them. One, it was the welfare state, mainly thinking of the refugees and asylum seekers based on a national model. In the case of Portugal, it was the Southern European model of welfare state, which emphasized a weak state and a strong civil society, with the specificity for Portugal that we call it welfare society, which is a Portuguese mix, where society tends to compensate the inefficiencies and incompetencies of the state, right? In gender, we see gender as a relational category that defines women and men positions in society, understanding that there are gender regimes, though these are the existing pattern of gender relations in societies, and these vary across societies. And in gender regime, you consider the division of labor, the power relation, the emotion and human relations, and the symbolic culture. that all tends to emphasize different regimes. And so then we need to understand that gender regimes are not neutral, as policies are not neutral. And incorporating a feminist perspective of welfare state model that suggests that gender inequalities are embedded in labor and social policies that reinforce family ideologies and gender roles. So gender mainstreaming is the dominant gender policy in the European Union. So gender mainstreaming is not neutral and kind of foster a specific type of gender regime, which may be very, very different from the gender regime where migrants are coming or refugees are coming from. And finally, the migration regimes that describe, and for our case, is what I call the multi-level ungovernance of migration and integration structure. So, and this is so because the structure for migration and integration includes national, European, and international frameworks, including the IOM and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, with competing and coexisting models for migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers that leads to unfair and differential policies. So some of the results from fieldwork. So women face several challenges. And here, I mean, it is in Portuguese. I was not able to translate, but you can see what people are coming from different countries, many of them Syria, but also other places. And so they spoke very different language, they practice different religions, etc., etc. So the challenges, and according to their own voices that they face, it was during the trajectory, many faced many challenges. Many of them did not want to talk much about the trajectory because that was very dangerous. So they said that they were afraid of because they were females. The lack of protection, the smugglers, the violence. So the trajectory was a challenge for women. In terms of the reception plans or programs, there was this idea of no choice, or that they had no choice, or the bad or the misinformation that they received, the no support network that they would have in Portugal as the host country, the poor conditions offered to them, the mismatch between the promises and the reality, the lack of support for female refugees and their families. Communication was a big obstacle because obviously they spoke different language, but there was a lack of language courses or proper language courses offered to these women, lack of translators. Courses were not designed for mothers with children. So they kind of used some courses like Portuguese courses that they have in general, try to make it for the refugees. And this did not work at all for many of these reasons related to gender. Labor market, there was another challenge. There was the inability to work or the lack of childcare provided for them to work. The employment, women saw the employment seen as they were being forced to work. They did not necessarily want to work. They did not have time to adapt. Some of them had never worked before. Others had worked, but they were not offered to work in something related. There was no training provided. And when jobs were offered, they were feminized jobs. So the very basic, the very low-end skills jobs. In relation to the reception identities, there was a lack of responses, a lot of discrimination and racism, the threat in relations, not gender and cultural sensitive training for this, for the people working in the NGOs or the government. The European model or gender model was imposed for family issues and labor market. The maternity was an issue because it was not addressed at all in their experience. And host society became a barrier for them to be good mothers due to language barriers, but also the inability for them to advocate for their children and themselves. They were unable to talk about their motherhood, especially for those that were first-time mothers. And there were a lot of them that were first-time mothers throughout this trajectory, or in this time they had become asylum seekers, refugees. There was for them no vision of a better future. some women said, in Portugal, I feel like a beggar. So they're always begging. And there were women from different social economic status, but they were always seen as ignorant and poor. And then the sudden changes in gender and social roles. There was no time to adjust and to understand this new role. So that, in their voices. Civil society organization also faced challenge, and it was interesting because Portugal, first of all, this is what they say, Portugal does not have a public response for refugees. Civil society does the work with European money. So this is exactly where fair society, what we said. Civil society is doing what the state is not doing, but maybe they're not doing right. Another comment was a firm decision about who coordinates and what model to follow is missing. So there's no leadership, there's not a certain goal, or they're not all walking in the same direction. So some of the challenges faced for civil society organizations also coincide with some of what the women said, mainly communication barriers. There's a lack of courses, lack of translators. So communication between those that are provided services and refugee women was very difficult. And we know the consequences. So there are a lot of also challenges were organizational, bureaucratic barrier, lack of state response, difficulty with the border police, documents and deadlines that were not respected, no access to decision makers. There was a lot of rotativity of administrator, lack of continuity in intervention, lack of trained human resources, lack of experience in working with refugees, uncertainty about who is responsible for what, lack of answers from the state agencies, and lack of planning. So you see that even civil society organization also agree with a lot of the comments from women. Labor market, there were issues with salaries and benefits because the salaries were always very low, and there was a lot of precarity in the labor market. And then the issue of having a benefit. If you were asylum seeker and got any kind of subsidy or benefit, that would imply that you were not able to work or you were not able to get another subsidy. And sometimes the subsidies were really, really low. We're talking about less than 200 euros a month. So that was also creating issues. Lack of monitorization, and also for them, it was difficult as well to gain trust and involvement of refugees because they're arriving in shock, and they're not, the NGOs and states not prepared to deal with that situation. And finally, the state. And I just focus on the gender blindness and gender mainstreaming. So state actors acknowledge the relevance of a gender perspective. Everyone thought it was relevant, that our project was important because we finally were addressing gender perspective. But we realize that all institutions, state and civil society partners had not any gender perspective. There were no gender specific. So these gender policies were totally absent. First, there were some excuses about it, saying, well, this is a new phenomenon, this is a learning curve, it was male dominated before, which is true, but it is true in Portugal. There is a history of, like women gaining access to labor market, or, there are things that have been done before. At least you should plan. Gender was in some cases, and I'll let you know which ones, were seen as what I call the gender curiosity, mainly related gender to sexuality or sexual orientation, but not the basic understanding of traditional gender roles. So it was very interesting because there was one couple in the whole country, one same-sex couple that had arrived and requested asylum, and they were granted this refugee status. And everyone was talking about them and addressing gender as sexual orientation, but not addressing the basic of this, situation of traditional gender roles. There was also, in the pre-departure that I mentioned, there was a lot of emphasis on violence against women, which is required by the European Union, but created resistance around family issues and distrust, right? That was in this departure training, husbands were many times portrayed as abuser, as violent subjects. And this was very hard for women because they had to deal with this new imposition I mean, I'm not saying that maybe they never experienced violence or at home, but it was very much imposed. And that was very, it was challenging for their relationship with their spouse, especially if they were coming as a family. There was a feminine, also very contradictory. There was a feminine traditional role being reinforced in the labor market for the jobs, but that was serving more employers than women. So we face a gender paradox. Or on the one hand, we promote, or they were promoting the liberation and autonomy of women, while also reinforcing traditional gender roles. Although there was acknowledgement of the relevance of gender in policymaking for refugees, there were different interpretations of what gender meant. For example, liberation, sexuality, etc. So at the beginning, many women perceived new gender roles as a personal and family threat because their traditional role in family was being questioned, was not being valued, or was being diminished. But after a while, some women also kind of appreciated the change in value, but they criticized that they were imposed and there was no time for them to adapt. So I wonder if gender blindness is the main determinant of the lack of policy for women or the consequence of mainstreaming. So gender mainstreaming has become the dominant policy making in Europe, and it has had some negative consequences. I would say mainly associated with migrant women, refugee women, or maybe women from the low economic status. So we should advocate for going back to the basic, maybe, trying to address gender and women issues with policies that target them specifically. Gender mainstreaming is based mainly on European values and European culture, and is being imposed as a model for these refugees. And in order to offer immediate real opportunity for women to progress, then we need to give them time and adjust to these new gender regimes. So finally, reflection still on the making is that in refugee matters, Portugal has developed a model of what I call the ungovernance and the bureaucratization of chaos, where state policies and strategies based on cooperation and articulation with civil society had translated in the state transferring obligations and responsibility to civil society, not in taking their own responsibility. So the state, there's a lack of overarching and organized integrated plan for asylum seekers and refugees, at least until we did the study. Now probably some things have been changing because some new framework have been adopted, but this is important to consider. The reception and integration policy for refugees in Portugal do not take into account gender. These policies are not neutral, but rather show gender blindness and gender incompetency. The transition between different gender regimes is not considered. The process is forced. There's no time to adapt. So an intersectional approach to gender is relevant also because it allows to identify othering processes such as racism, discrimination, Islamophobia. And also refugee women identify racism and discrimination as something practiced by both society, but also by some civil society organizations that were serving them. So they're reproducing these stereotypes and enforcing them on women. Gender mainstreaming policies have weakened reception and integration policies. And this is first because the gender mainstreaming policy at the European level have weakened and dismantled gender-specific policies that maybe existed before. So they should be more focused on women and girls with differentiated type of policies and intervention. Main actions focus on domestic and gender-based violence, which has generated further victimization for refugee women, portraying husbands as abusers and violent subjects, reinforcing feminine actions and roles for jobs, and putting a limited emphasis on professional training for refugee women that value their backgrounds and culture or see them as capable subjects. And then finally, a final note that I have is on positionality. So maybe we need to think and maybe reimagine positionality. And in this case, I'm being very critical of myself, of our research project, although sometimes it's very difficult when you plan it. New interpretation of paths for facilitating. So what would be a new path of interpretation for facilitating cross-cultural research design that avoids this kind of patchwork that we had to do? And I know that it is difficult, but something to reflect when thinking about new projects. However, even with the imperfections and the challenge that we even face as a research team, I believe that our project collected relevant data, providing new tips for future research and intervention, and also providing some voice for women. So thanks for listening, and here are some pictures from the fieldwork that we did. Did I stop sharing? I'm sorry, I think I talked too much, but.
Thank you, ma'am. I'll be moderating the question and answer session. I request any of our participants, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Yes, Professor Camelia Tigao.
Hi, I hope I'm audible. Yeah? Yes, you can hear me?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible. Yes.
Well, I love the talk and all these findings, and I would really like to read more about it. If in case you have a paper written already, please, maybe you can share either in English or in Spanish. And I was really appalled by the thing that some of the women had never worked before. So they are becoming skilled during the migration process. It's like then migration becomes an educational process. So this, I think, is quite an important finding. I have a couple of questions, very easy to answer, I think. The first one is Portugal has a private sponsorship program similar to Canada, but address the refugee problem. And then the second is, what is your take, I mean, your opinion on the temporary model of reception instead of recognizing refugees? Some of the people who work with the civil society in other countries say this is good because it allows like a fast integration, and maybe it's a quick way to get access to the job market. But I wonder if this is really a good solution, or maybe the solution is to speed up the refugee recognition programs. And then, well, I have a more general question. I was just wondering if the IOM, maybe you know, if the IOM includes the refugees in their 201 million migrants, or they separate, because sometimes I get confused if these people are included or not, or because it's more than statistics. It's just considering that refugees are something else different to migration when they are actually forced migrants. So these are my questions, and congratulations, Beatriz.
Thank you, Camelia. These are very good questions. So let me start with so since we did the project, and I think since the refugee, the 2015-16 refugee crisis, a lot of new ways to see refugees or asylum seekers and programs for them have been envisioned. Portugal has not adopted, until that time, they had not adopted any of these private sponsorship programs. Italy has, I think Canada is well known for doing that. But I think those are very, very like tiny programs, and they're not necessarily offering like a society solution to the situation. And I'm not very convinced of what I see. So these are, maybe like they believe that they tend to be more successful because someone is sponsoring you. So again, the obligation or the responsibility is going to rely on the sponsors and not on the state. And this is, also goes along with this idea of, okay, we might need to grant temporary solutions. And that's why we see that all these new status are being created as a kind of, okay, in the meantime, we just, you get the subsidiary protection or the humanitarian or whatever, as a way for them to see what happens. Because in the end, they're hoping that they're going to go back to their country. So I think it's always the hoping that they'll return to their own home country. Although we know that might not happen, especially once they arrive to the European Union or to the global north, where, coming, back and forth is not so easy. I think ideally it would be much better if the refugee status would be granted, but I see a lot of resistance because if the status is granted, then they will have permanent residents, or the people that are going to stay and probably become permanent residents. And if we see the number of approvals for refugee status is minimum, and that kind of happened not just in Europe, but in several other contexts. So I just feel that is what especially states from the global north are kind of deciding. I don't think that is a productive solution, because it keeps, you keep perpetuating this precarity to people that are in very precarious situations, and that's not necessarily helping, because we are not helping them maybe to develop more connections with the host society, or they are not able to move forward with, having a new life. When you are a refugee, certain things are facilitated. Even, and I know that you work on qualitative, on high-skilled migrants, so even the recognition of diplomas or the recognition of their previous career is much more facilitated for refugees than when you're just like asylum seeker or under this protection. So I think that should be something to consider. However, I would also argue that ideally, if some of the refugees or asylum seekers could become migrants right away, or in the sense of accessing residency, it would be much more desirable. And this is maybe a disagreement that sometimes I have with legal scholars or with lawyers, that lawyers always argue that people should apply to become refugees or get this kind of a status. But I feel that some countries, especially when countries have very friendly migration policies, and I can give you the example of Portugal in this case, but also of Argentina, when the migration policies are so friendly, it's better to become a resident than to go through this recognition, because to become a refugee, there's so many steps, and sometimes it's very re-victimize the refugee or like the asylum seeker. So those are things to take into account. I know, for example, for the cases of Venezuelans, in Argentina, there were not many cases of people requesting at least asylum, because it was easier and better for them to become migrants. It was they could have access to the labor market right away. Obviously, there were no language barriers or things like that. So I think sometimes we are creating a monster in this, like when we protect these status that are sort of unique and not so they don't necessarily protect people. And so I don't know if that kind of answered your question. And then the statistic about the IOM, I think the IOM has been changing a lot for the last 20 years or even more. But And first of all, the IOM just became only in 2016, if I'm not wrong, part of the UN system, because the IOM was not. Although no one knew, or they would never claim, they were not part of the United Nations system, but they became. So now I think that is much more coordination in the terminology and concepts. And I mean, I don't know if I can answer your question about the millions, because you're right. Sometimes migrants may or not include refugees and asylum seekers, and also may or not include the internally displaced people, which we know there are millions and millions, and they experience kind of the same reality. So I don't have an official answer to your question, because I mean, it would be interesting to compare for example, the United Nations Commission for Refugees, or the IOM, or all these different UN organizations define and count for migrants, because I don't think they even had the same number. So that's a good observation. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We
Thanks.
have Ms. Priyanka Nayak. She has a query in our chat box. She asked that if you can share ways or resolutions to recommend to address the women refugees issues. And just now she has asked that, how do you see refugees impacting the domestic politics in the host countries? And how do you see its reflection on host nations' policy and approach toward refugees?
Mm-hmm.
This is from Ms. Priyanka Nayak.
Yes. How do you see refugees impacting domestic policy in the host countries? Well, I mean, the Priyanka question is a very good question. I think that refugees obviously may or may not impact domestic politics, but we know that anything that relates to migration, including refugees and asylum seekers, nowadays is very political and is very ideological. So the way that the state and the way that society may embrace welcoming or not so welcoming reactions to incoming flows can have an impact. I think the example I was giving of Portugal, I think is very unique in the sense that for many reasons that is not here that I need to explain, Portugal likes to be recognized as an open country, likes to be recognized as winning awards from the United Nations or from the European Union for being a welcoming country. And so in that way, it's unique. But then we see a lot of countries that could care less about that, right? And they don't care if people see this country as not welcoming or very, opposed to migration. So, and also this impact may vary a lot. If we are facing a so-called crisis like the Ukrainian crisis right now, or whatever was called the crisis in 2017-16 or not. And that can reflect obviously in how, and we see this all the time, migration policies and integration policies changing all the time, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. So there is obviously an impact that is taking place. Sometimes this impact also relates to what we see as waves of, the world becoming more conservative, the world becoming less conservative. Sometimes we have governments that go along more with the right or more with the left. And this, has an influence on the policies, and that's why policies change. In Europe, however, because the situation, is the same, but at the same time, because of the European Union has directive and has some policies that are common, some countries had to follow. So the way they incorporate the directives may be a little bit different. They are not always the same, but the trends, might vary a little bit. So that's, I would say that refugees are impacting domestic politics. Many times, also we know that around elections time, migration arises as an issue or not. It all depends if candidates are, willing or interested in discussing migration issues in national elections, or sometimes might be an issue and candidates do not want to talk it, because we also know that it's a very divisive situation or issue. And also it depends, we're talking about an emigration country or an immigration country. So I don't know if that answered your question. And you translated me another question
Yes, there's one question from Miss Fatima Jibrila. She is from Niger. She has shared her opinion that in her country also there are many refugees due to armed conflicts in Niger.
What was that again? Can you say it?
Miss Fatima, she has mentioned that in her country also there are many refugees due to armed conflicts. Niger.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, remember that that's an excellent point. Remember I mentioned most of the refugees, I was going to talk about refugees in Europe, but most of the refugees in the world are not in Europe. They would like to maybe get to Europe, but most of the refugees are either in neighboring countries or become internally displaced people. So, and that's a reality. And sometimes for these refugees or asylum seekers, there's not always a lot of resources available. I mean, unless they come from the United Nations. So we see the largest refugee camps are not in Europe. We know that, right? But at the same time, most of the time, these policies are done from the global north. That's why it's always important that we understand. So it is true, and many times in these countries that maybe have weak welfare states, they are not too worried about supporting refugees, because they, maybe there's not also good support for national citizens, and because the displacement is caused by a very specific situation in a country, and is pushing people around. So and that's why the situation of these refugees and asylum seekers is so complicated. And then we wonder, or you wonder, is becoming a refugee, in certain countries, would that make a difference? And that's why people, some people spend all their life living in the tents in the refugee camps, right? So I don't know if I'm answering that question, but that's true, and that's something that we need to realize, and maybe that would be a reason why some regional solutions should be discussed. Okay, and this, I mean, again, I can give you an example of Latin America, of exactly what happened with the Venezuelans, migrants and refugees. So whether, the countries like it or not, they had to come together and organize, and although it was not mandatory, come up with some solution at the regional level to see what could be done. What could be done, in the neighboring country or the other countries that were receiving Venezuelans, refugees or migrants. So I think that regional solutions and discussions should be, taken into account.
Professor Sadasa?
Yes,
Please.
I enjoyed your talk, Professor, and it was very informative and based on case studies, interviews, and all. I have a small question. Before COVID, many countries were somewhat, they're managing migration positively. During COVID, so many countries unilaterally made, we targeted the migrants and refugees and other people, and that actually very inhuman for many countries. So do you find certain kind of departure before and COVID, before and after COVID?
Can you repeat the last part? Sorry.
Do you find some difference towards in refugee from different states before COVID-19 and after COVID-19?
Well, I mean, I think that when we talk about COVID, it's before COVID and after COVID. I think even our lives have been impacted by that. And during COVID, many things happened. One, it was that there was immobility, or not everyone was able to move, right? So what it caused in somehow was a pause of migration movement, including refugees, or because everything was on standby. There were not people recording or accepting requests. Everything, I think, in every country, all the residency permits, asylum requests, was kind of, everything was on standby. And only people that move across the borders was because they had no options, or there was not necessarily control, but a lot of people were caught on the move. And so that was very specific, a situation of COVID, with some things going back to normal, slowly and at different times. So I guess what also happened is that some countries kind of issue different legal frameworks or temporary solution for certain things, for those people already in a country, whether they were going to access or not health services. And because we were in a health crisis, so would they be able to get vaccination? So that was a huge issue during COVID and after, and sometimes it might be still an issue. Some countries arguing that it's better, when it is a matter of public health, it's better to give access to health to everyone, because if I get sick, then everyone else can get sick, right? Or just saying, okay, no, we're just going to protect our citizens or our own nationals or the legals. But then you're not protecting overall society because they don't have access, for example, to vaccination or other things. But I guess COVID was had probably a much larger impact on mobile population and people that were on the move. And more people losing jobs, more people not being able to survive, more people needing to, but at the same time, this kind of activated a lot of networks of people to help each other. But I don't know if that responds to your question.
Thank you, ma'am. We have Ms. Michelle Menpio, a resident of Cameroon. She is the secretary of the Action Research Group on Migration in Central Africa. She has given a suggestion that we could have this seminar with an interpretation in other languages. We will do the needful, Ms. Michelle. Thank you. And next, ma'am, we have one question from Ms. Marlene Oviedo. I think she has given her opinion that a lot of work to do in this matters, and an articulation between government, civil organization, and academy, it's fundamental for success. So this is her opinion. Your take on this, ma'am?
Thank you, Marilyn. I know Marilyn. So thank you, Marilyn. And that's true. I think that sometimes we are not all working together. There's competing interests. So I think that the academia can play a role, and sometimes we can mediate. But I think it's very important that all institutions work together, and that the voice of migrants, the voice of refugees is taken into account, and that they represent themselves. I think that is very important, because if not, when we use intermediaries or someone that's going to speak on behalf of them, then we might run into issues of people really not interpreting or representing what they need or their expectations. So thank you, Marilyn.
We would like to take a few more questions. Anybody, please? You could raise your hand or write in the chat box.
All important questions are addressed. I couldn't find any. Dr. Raj is not here.
Raj is not. Dr. Raj is not here. She has conveyed her gratitude and she has left for another work.
Okay.
Yes.
So we are 9 o'clock now.
It's yes. I think it is again Priyanka, Miss Priyanka
Okay,
Nayak. Yes, she has
I
asked
seen
for
the question now.
yes to address
So-
it. She has asked for your resolutions recommended to address the women's refugees issues. I think.
Well, if I my answer to the last one, I mean, I think that that's what I want you to talk a little bit about the gender mainstreaming, which is the very specific way that Europe is dealing with gender policies. And I don't think that is the best one, personally, because I think that you can only get to gender mainstreaming maybe as, maybe the European did for a reason, the European Union did for a reason, but I think that when you deal with different kind of population, in this case, what we really need is are policies that are targeting women, that are, and I know that some of them, or sometimes these policies are criticized for being like too basic, but you cannot move beyond or forward if you don't solve the basic. And at this point, I think that we're not solving, or the basic have not been necessarily solved. So that's what I think. For example, if you're going to provide language courses for women, you need to take into account that these women may have maybe if they had children, they cannot go anytime at the time that someone decides, well, the course is being offered. And I know exactly that was the case for Portugal, because some of the time the courses that were offered for everyone, and they were not taking into account any gender issue. They would not offer, maybe in some cultures, maybe women would not go if they don't have all women courses. So that was not taken into account. Or they would be offered at a time where women would not take the children, or they would not have someone who to leave the children with. So I know that these are basic, but this is something that you need to consider if you want women to become active. Women in that sense, take longer to learn the language, not because they have less, skills or capacities, because they're not offering them solutions when they are dealing with a lot of changes, with, adapting to the country. Sometimes you just also need more time. Something that the women also needed and mentioned, that they really need like spaces for social interaction, but those were not necessarily created. So something so basic as that. And that, for example, there was this policies of decentralizing or deconcentrating people, because this is okay, we don't like ghetto policies, or we don't want to have this where all just migrants or all just refugee live, which I understand the standpoint, but at the same time, if you send them far away, they will never be able to meet someone like them and maybe have conversation in their own language, because they're being sent to like small village in the middle of nowhere, where they're not mosque, or they're not temple where they can even practice their religion. So I think the solutions always are better when we talk to the people, not just offer them from like the top down. And see, the refugee, I mean, the issue that women may have may be very different depending where they're coming from, what, where their life experience, whether they worked before or whether they did not work before. Some of them are very young. It was, for many of them, was very, very traumatic, the experience. So that's not something that they really want to talk about all the time, right? So offering or creating these spaces might be relevant. I don't know if that answers your question, Priyanka.
Yes, she has replied. And thank you very much, ma'am. And thank you, Priyanka. I think if there are no more questions, we can end this session.
Yes,
Yes.
and I would thank Dr. Padilla for the valuable experience from the field, and especially on the very important pressing issue of the refugee woman, and also talk about the best practices, especially the gender mainstreaming. Thank you so much for sparing your valuable time. And with that, I would also like to thank our partners, CSAN and GRFDT, they've helped us make the Thursday Forum visible globally. And we look forward to build on this collaboration for the seminars to come and also other activities that are in the pipeline. I thank all of you for becoming a part of this seminar today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, and a very happy International Women's Day wishes to you and to all the esteemed ladies here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, everyone.